Europe should use this threat of the recently established US government as an opportunity to become stronger. How? Well, Professor Siotis will tell you more about this. The proposed new EU pharma package and its impact on European or Europe's competitiveness and the competitiveness for orphan or drug development in general. Professor Siotis earned his bachelor from the London School of Economics. He earned a master's of advanced European studies from the College of Europe in Bruges and a PhD from the doctoral school Icares at ULB. He joined the Universidad Carlos III de Madrid, where he teaches competition policy and empirical industrial organization. He was a senior economic advisor and technical assistant coordinator in the European Commission Task Force for Greece. He was a member of the DG Competition's chief economist team, where he worked on the development of horizontal policies and actively participated in merger, antitrust, and state aid cases. He participated in the European Commission sector inquiry of the pharmaceutical industry. Currently, he's an associate consultant with Compass Lexicon, and his research focuses on the empirical analysis of competitive processes. Professor Siotis, I'm very honored to have you here, and you can take the floor. Thank you.
Good morning. Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, excellent. So I'm supposed to share my screen, I suppose.
If you will.
Yes. This one. Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
I
great.
presume you're seeing my slides, right?
We do.
Okay.
Yes, we do.
Good
Thank
morning. Thank you for the invitation. I was at the conference yesterday, so I will refer to some of the things that were said yesterday. I will try not to impinge on what Matthias is going to say later on. So my talk today is going to focus on the pharma package, the pharma reform package of the European Union. So the last big reform in Europe was around 25 years ago, around the turn of the century. And since a few years, the Commission has been working on a reform package. And according to the Commission itself, it's the most important reform in 20 years. It covers the general pharma regulation, but also all the tools or the legal instruments, regulatory tools for orphan diseases. So if you look at the goals, which are the official goals, you can see immediately, and that's why we are known as the decimal scientists, the economists, there is a tension among these goals, which is affordability and accessibility and sustainability of health system, and on the other hand, competitiveness of the EU pharma industry. Now, competitiveness, it's great, fantastic, but of course that competitiveness is often understood as rewarding generously the pharma industry, which basically means high prices. So there is the objectives are all laudable here, but there is an intrinsic tension between affordability, access, and competitiveness, or let's say the rewards to the pharma industry. So what I'm going to do today is going to look at the proposed reform, but with very much a focus on orphan diseases, because orphan diseases are interesting, and in a way they crystallize all the issues that are behind or have been driving the current reform. And it highlights the tensions or the trade-offs that you have in the pharma industry and, or let's say, pharma regulation, or how we deal with the pharma industry. Now, just to give you a timeline, it's a slow process. understandably so, because it's a very important reform, and you don't want to have to change the legal, let's say, the legal environment every 2 or 3 years. So hopefully that will be a reform that will be in force for quite a few years, if it's well done, even decades. So it was launched, the proposal was launched in 2023 by the Commission. Then the European Parliament looked at the proposal, amended it. It amended it within the initial time frame, which surprised quite a few people because, it was 1 year, but many people thought it would take longer because of the complexity of the issues. And right now, in 2025, it's with Council. And hopefully, next year, we will complete the trilogue, which meaning when Council, Parliament, and the Commission all have adopted their position, which may be slightly different, they will negotiate together, and we will have adoption in 2027, with then 2 years for the transition period and adoption of the legislation. Now, when you talk about the pharma industry, it's as Hilde has mentioned already, we're talking about global competition, we're talking about a global market, but with many regional idiosyncrasies. And you have the world level, you have the European level, then many things happen at member state level. But in some member states, a lot also happens at the regional level. You mentioned, Hilde, health technology assessment in the country where I live. You don't only have, which is Spain, you don't only have health technology assessment at the level of the central state of Spain, but also the regions then evaluate the different drugs in order to decide whether they will pay for it, because health is a transferred competency to the regions in Spain. So sometimes it even goes below the national level. Now, it's a large industry, 1.3 trillion worldwide, and that was for 2020. So probably you can add a few hundred billion since then. By far, the largest market is the US. It's a bit less than half, but it's always between 45 and 50%. Largest market for two reasons. First of all, it's a large country. It's a developed country, so high income. Although health outcomes are not always great, but high income on average, and also very high prices. And that's why the US market represents half of the world market for pharma. The growth prospects are also quite impressive. On average, for this decade, we should have double-digit growth of around 11%. Now, I mentioned this. In Europe, health is a member state competency. There are huge differences of access. Yesterday, Professor Karaksin talked about access to vaccines across the world, but even within the EU, you have differences in terms of which drugs are available or paid for by social security systems and when. And here you can clearly see economic forces. The drugs are made available soon, early on, in countries which are large and have high prices. Basically, for example, now in Europe, within the EU, on average, the German population has access to more drugs and sooner. While in countries that are small in terms of GDP per capita, the drugs, number of drugs available is much smaller, and they come in much later, sometimes 4, 5, 6 years later. And part of the reform tries to address that issue. Now, the issue of availability across member states that differs so much has one root cause, which is prices are set at the national level by social security system, what is reimbursed and what is not reimbursed in our welfare systems in Europe. And the prices, as a consequence, differ a lot. And at the same time, we are within a single market, so you have free trade, so that you can have cheap drugs sold, let's say, in Greece, and then they can be re-imported into high-priced countries. And that explains why pharma is not making available drugs soon in low-priced countries, precisely in order to avoid this tension, which stems from having a single market but nationally regulated prices. And that's an issue that you should bear it in mind because it's a very serious issue. We don't talk too much about it, but the economists are very much aware of that dimension. Now, part of the reforms, the reform proposals of the Commission was to give very strong incentives or to punish firms for not making the drugs available in all member states. That has been abandoned, quite simply because it was unrealistic what the Commission was proposing. And it was unrealistic because so far there is no way to have more uniform prices in Europe, simply because some member states cannot pay what other member states can pay. Now, in terms of the industry itself, it's an industry where you've heard about it, you're very familiar with this, where investment cycles are very long, highly uncertain, and it requires an awful lot of capital. At the same time, it's an industry that requires a stable framework. You need to have some legal certainty, with these long investment cycles and these huge needs of capital. You can't ask a private agent to invest $500 million if you're going to change the rules of the game tomorrow. So the legal framework, the stability of the system is key. Now, what is the cost of developing new drugs? Here you have numbers flying around. One number that I've heard or that is mentioned, or a range is industry says, well, between 1 and 8 billion. Some academic work done in Toulouse by Pierre Dubois and his research group has come with an implicit cost of 2.5 billion. Whatever. It's 1 billion, 2 billion, or even $500 million, but it's an awful lot. And finally, it's an industry, as you've heard, and Hilde, each time I listen to her, I learn new things on these new developments. She's on top of things. I mean, it's incredible how fast this industry is evolving. Now, one thing which, on the other hand, is pretty much constant through time, at least in the US, but pretty much the same thing could be said in Europe, is that the pharma industry is a highly profitable industry. So on the left, you have the period 1930 to 1980, where you compare the average market performance of the market, of the stock market, basically, of shares over time. That's the green line. And then you have pharma, blue, and tech in orange. And you can see that pharma and tech outperformed the market very substantially during that time period. And on average, pharma is slightly more profitable than tech. Now, in 1980, you have this discontinuity in the graph. It's not that things collapse, but it's because of the emergence of biotech. Biotech emerges from the 1980s and onwards. And if you look at the right-hand side of the graph, you can see that pharma still outperforms the market. Tech slightly outperforms the market and not even. And biotech completely underperforms the market. Biotech is not a profitable industry on average. It's very, very, very risky. You have some big success stories, but most ventures fail. That was mentioned yesterday by one of the panelists that said, it's only 15% of projects that see to fruition. So from the economics perspective, it's quite important to make the difference between pharma and biotech because their performance is quite different. Now, what's the business model of pharma, of big pharma? It has increasingly moved towards a business model based on blockbusters. Blockbusters, you're most probably familiar. It's drugs that generate more than 1 billion in annual revenue worldwide. Now, just to give you an example, AstraZeneca, that was mentioned, in 2021, it had total sales of 36 billion. So it's not huge, but it's a significant amount of sales. And it had 13 blockbusters. So 5 of which generated 15 billion. So you had 15 billion, which is a bit less than half generated by 5 drugs. But then since it has 13 blockbusters, you have another 8 drugs that generate at least 1 billion each. So 15 plus 8, it's 23 billion. Huge proportion of the total sales of AstraZeneca. So Big Pharma sells many drugs, but their revenue comes from a few, or the bulk of their revenue comes from a few blockbusters. The case of Pfizer is a bit special because of the COVID vaccine. But if you look across Big Pharma, you get the same picture. Now, if pharma is based on blockbusters, or that's the business model today, what drives investment in these blockbusters? As economists, we don't think of accounting costs, but we think very much in terms of opportunity costs. And in this context, what does it mean? It means that each time you put €1 somewhere, or 1 million of research money into a research project, you don't put it somewhere else. So you can have a research project that the expected return is 20%, which is positive in accounting terms. So you have positive net present value. But at the same time, if you have another competing project, which in expected terms will give you 50%, investing in the first project involves a huge opportunity cost because you're not investing in the more profitable one. So the fact that blockbusters are so profitable, it makes the cost of investing in other things, in other projects, more expensive. So you can think of Big Pharma as an organization where different research departments compete for the allocation of capital. And since blockbusters are so profitable, in order to be able to attract money for your research projects, you need to offer in expected terms the same profitability as a blockbuster. Now, in that context, you have a priori 2 types of drugs that should not receive any attention on the part of Big Pharma. And here you have 2 cases, antimicrobial resistance. Hilde has mentioned it, and Jorge Mestre will give a lecture later on. Here you have a huge problem of getting firms to invest in that line, but also orphan diseases or drugs to treat orphan diseases. Orphan diseases in Europe, it's defined as a disease that affects 5 people in 10,000. In the US, it's an absolute number of 200,000 people, but in terms of percentage of the population, it's quite similar. Same thing in Japan, etc. And therefore, for orphan diseases, which affect very few people, and some of them are ultra-rare diseases that affect not even 1 in 10,000, it's 1 in 30,000, you would never expect pharma to be interested in this because the expected revenue, that's what is on the last line, minus the expected production cost, minus R&D, clearly is going to be negative. So a priori, the sign of the inequality is the one that appears on the screen. For antibiotics, that's probably true, and that's part of the problem. It's still true. But for rare disease, at least a subset of rare diseases, this is not the case. Now, to go back a bit to understand what is happening with orphan drugs and rare diseases, the equation or the inequality that was on the previous slide tells you, well, there will never be an incentive to invest research money to treat rare diseases. So what we need is to have a more generous regulatory framework to stimulate research for rare diseases. Hilde mentioned patents. So the patents, they protect an active pharmaceutical ingredient, they protect one chemical substance, but to treat one disease, for example, high blood pressure, but you can have competing products to treat high blood pressure. And you have literally tens of them. Same for anti-cholesterol. Now, for orphan diseases, the regulatory framework that was adopted was to, well, the logic was to be more generous in terms of legal monopoly rights. Patent right is a legal monopoly. Well, the solution was to grant market exclusivity. So market exclusivity is not monopoly rights on a substance, but on a pool of patients, meaning that if you are the first to provide a treatment for rare disease and you get a marketing authorization from the European Medicines Agency or the FDA in the US, then you have a monopoly on the pool of patients, okay? There are exceptions. If somebody comes up with a significantly better product, and that has happened in a few areas, but for the vast majority of orphan diseases, you have one pharmacological treatment. The idea was you need to have this extra incentive, and this would also give incentives for repurposing, which is basically convince firms to use or to explore the possibility of using an existing drug to treat a rare disease by conducting research and clinical trials, et cetera, et cetera. So I insist for rare disease, exclusivity is more generous because you don't get exclusivity on a drug, you get exclusivity on the pool of patients. It all started in the US in 1983 because patients were asking for some special push to push money into research for rare diseases. And in Europe, it took us a bit longer. We have the orphan drug regulation since the year 2000, and that's part of the current reform package. For the 2000 regulation is going to be reformed as well. Now, the results have been spectacular, both in the US and in Europe. In the US, you had no treatment initially in 83, went up. These are not marketing authorizations. These are orphan drug designations, but the two are very correlated. And in Europe, you can clearly see fast take-up from the adoption of regulation. Now, how come that, or what's the economics behind this success? Well, when I saw this data for the first time, I could not believe it, but it's been corroborated from many different sources. Orphan diseases and orphan drugs have become very, 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 very big business. Here you have the proportion for these big pharma firms, you have their sales in 21 and 26, the predicted sales for 21 and 26, and you have the growth rate of the sales for orphan drugs. Positive, very often, double digit. But more importantly, on the right-hand side, you have the worldwide sales of these companies, and you have the percentage of total sales that come from orphan drugs. And I would have expected that, the proportion coming from orphan drugs would be, say, 1, 2, 3, max 5%. But even for some big companies, really large companies, Astra, Roche, Novartis, we are above 20%, and sometimes even reaching 40% or close to 40%. That is to say, today, orphan drugs have become a very important part of the revenues of big pharma. And Matthias is going to talk extensively about the Draghi report, I imagine, later on. But the Draghi report has a chapter on pharma, and if you look at these figures from the Draghi report, particularly the one on the left of the screen, you can see the absolutely incredible growth in orphan medicines compared to the total. The total, there is very substantial growth between 2012 and 22. It looks like a flat line, but it isn't. But it looks flat because it is compared, it's the same index for orphan medicines. According to the Draghi report, the sales of orphan drugs between 2012 and 2022 was multiplied by a factor of 24. It's not 24%, it's 24 times. Okay, 24 times. So it's an amazing growth. Now, since the Draghi report is about European competitiveness, it compares the performance of the EU with the performance of the US, and some worrying signs in the sense that the EU is losing ground. Now, this means that this orphan drug regulation has been, both in the US and in Europe, has been very successful in attracting research money into the treatment of orphan diseases. However, you have the downside of this success. First of all, the budgetary cost starts becoming substantial. Initially, the argument was, very expensive treatments, but very few patients. So the budgetary cost is very limited. Well, already now, as of today, not now because it is older data, but the budgetary cost of treating orphan diseases is exploding. Okay, and clearly this is not sustainable in the longer term. In addition, despite this huge commercial success, 95% of orphan diseases have no pharmacological treatment. Some have different treatment, like surgery, like other things, but in terms of pharmacological treatment, 95% are not treated. In addition, most treatments are concentrated in oncology, okay? Or at least the oncology represents a very large share. And then another downside of another success is, I think, the fact that medicine or diagnostics have become much more precise, so that some diseases that were considered as one pathology now have been subdivided into subpathologies, such that, that explains why so many cancers are considered to be rare today. And they are, of course, eligible then for the market exclusivity associated with the orphan drug regulation. Now, one question that arises on the table is, of course, are you doomed to pay a lot of money for orphan drugs? And in this graph here, you have the number, you have the revenue per year, or the cost per person per year, and here the incidence on the horizontal axis. So you either have very, very costly treatments for very few patients, or you have a few more patients. This is for the US, so it's the absolute value of 200,000. You have some diseases which are borderline non-rare, and there the price may be high, but it's affordable. Let's say $10,000, $15,000 or euros per year. Now, are we doomed to have only treatments that are on this kind of ISO revenue curve? That is to say, treating patients with orphan diseases is going to be costly come what may. And I'm mentioning here that it does not include, you can see here, the most expensive treatment at that time, which is 2017, was $500,000. But of course, we know, and Hilde mentioned some of these treatments that are now, the asking price is, or the list price is a few million euros or US dollars. Now, in fact, this is not the case. There's a lot more heterogeneity than we may think, because in the previous graph, it was the best-selling drugs. So by definition, you would not look at this corner close to the origin. And if you do, you actually realize that you have quite a few treatments where the incidence is low, but the price is still manageable. And here you don't find this, kind of downward sloping clear line that you had before. This is for Europe, for the UK actually, but it's even the same thing for the US. So you do have many, many treatments or many drugs that are close to the origin. And I think the real challenge is to simulate, to manage to give incentives to develop drugs like these that treat a rare disease, sometimes even ultra-rare disease, okay, but at an affordable price. Now, to conclude on quickly on the reform proposal, the main point I would like to make is that the reform proposal goes in the right direction, I think, both for the general pharma regulation, which I've not mentioned so far, but also for the orphan drug regulation. The Commission is basically trying to modulate the main instrument, which is market exclusivity or the duration of market exclusivity for orphan drugs, in order to deal with the diversity of situations that you have. And I think that goes in the right direction. But it remains the fact that it's just playing with exclusivity, and that's one instrument. And the kind of challenges that we have with respect to rare diseases are multiple. And, Tim Bergen, the first Nobel Prize in economics, said, if you have different objectives, you should have one instrument for each objective. And the bottom line is that the Commission is modulating its main instrument, and that goes in the right direction, but it's not going to be enough. So let me give you a summary, a very brief summary of what the current situation is. Now in Europe, for orphan drugs, you have 10 years of market exclusivity. So in principle, if you get your marketing authorization for the EMA, you have 10 years where you're going to be a monopolist, not on your drug, but on the pool of patients. There are exceptions, but the default rule is 10 years of exclusivity, which can be extended by 2 years. Okay, if it's pediatric treatment, etc. And there are ways to extend to a maximum of 12 years. The current proposal, and this is what it says here, EC proposal, European Commission proposal, extends the total period, the maximum possible, but modulates it. That is to say, it goes, instead of having 10 years as a standard, which can be extended by 2, it's 9 years, and then it can be extended by a further 3 years. Now, in order to push pharma in the direction of undertaking research for the diseases that have no treatment, that is to say, diseases that represent a high unmet medical need, this HUMN, the baseline is not 9, it's 10 years, and it can be extended, okay? And then, in order to deal with some of the excesses that were observed in the past with the current regulation, the Commission proposes to reduce the exclusivity, the market exclusivity, to 5 years for so-called bibliographical marketing authorization. What are these? Well, these are cases where a drug, for example, that has been in the public domain, that is to say, where you have generics for a very, very long time, that treat a common disease, but it has also been discovered by chance, almost, let's say by chance, that it can treat an orphan disease. And some firms have exploited that market opportunity. That is to say, firms have used the existing scientific knowledge without doing any research themselves, not conducting any clinical trials themselves, but showing efficacy on the basis of the scientific evidence available, and then obtaining a marketing authorization, giving it the monopoly over this pool of patients that suffer from the disease. Now, this has led to excesses. This has led to excesses. There is, just to mention, there's a very well-known case for people like me who work on competition and competition issues of a firm. It's no secret. It's called Lidient. There was a case in Holland. There was a case in Italy. And Lidient, what it did was to basically get an MA for the treatment of a very rare disease using a compound that was commonly available, because it had been a generic drug for a very long time. And the cost of treatment went from, let's say, 200 euros per year per patient to more than 14,000. So the price increase was stratospheric. Now, in order to avoid this type of situations, the Commission initially proposed to reduce for this bibliographical marketing authorization, or based only on published existing literature, from 10 to 5 years. Now, the European Parliament slightly amended the Commission proposal. For example, for bibliographical application, goes back from 5 to 6, not 10, but to 6. But the thrust is quite similar. Now, other good things with this reform, apart from the exclusivity, the length of the exclusivity, what the Commission has proposed is to have a global marketing authorization for a compound. That is to say, if you have a drug that can treat a rare disease, what had been observed in the past is that firms would launch the product to treat a rare disease, for example, a rare cancer, and then shortly before the end of the exclusivity period, based on their own experience, knowing that the probability of success to treat another rare cancer was very high, they would do very limited clinical research and get a new marketing exclusivity for another 10 years to treat another rare cancer, but with the same active ingredient. So you could have these chain links of exclusivities extending, pushing de facto pushing the 10 years well beyond the 10 years limit. So with this global MA, this kind of behavior should be limited. It also has introduced, I don't have time to go into the details, but the current legislation limits the attractiveness or reduces the attractiveness of what is known as evergreening or product hopping, which is basically I make a very, very minor modification to my product, just enough in order to get a new patent on the product, and on the basis of that patent, ask for a marketing authorization for another 10 years. Okay, so it's not the same product which is chain linked across diseases. It's for the same disease, but launching of a second generation product, which is therapeutically speaking identical to the first generation, or almost identical to the first generation, but is sufficiently different in order to be able to get a new patent. The Commission has also decided or proposed to limit the orphan designation to 7 years. Now, for orphan drugs, the process is that you first ask for orphan designation, which is, look, you go to the MA and you say, my drug has the potential to treat that disease, that orphan disease. and you get an orphan designation. And once you have the designation, up until the reform, you could have it forever. Okay. Now the Commission says, if you get your designation, you either have a marketing authorization, meaning you've done research and you've come up with something after 7 years, or you lose your orphan designation forever. I already mentioned the bibliographical MAs and the positive nudge towards high unmet needs in the current legislation, in the proposed legislation, to try to push laboratories to do research for rare diseases for which there is no treatment at the moment. And one last thing, it makes the current proposals make it easier and faster for the launch of, at the end of the period of the exclusivity, for biosimilars or generic, if we're talking about small molecules. Now, I started at the beginning of my talk by saying that there is this tension, which is the tension between access, meaning low prices, sustainability, meaning of the budget system, of the health systems, which means low prices, and innovation, competitiveness, and all the rest. This tension is always going to be there. The question is how we strike the right balance. In the US, for example, the very high prices are justified on the basis of the need to give the incentives for innovation. In Europe, we have a slightly different system. Industry will always say that, we are too restricted in Europe, and that will push EU firms outside the EU, and research will not happen here. I'm a bit skeptical of this argument. First of all, because research can be done anywhere, and production can be done somewhere else, etc., etc. And second, with the current legislation, where Europe has been quite generous in terms of exclusivity for orphan drugs, for example, we've seen that Europe, with even quite generous legislation in terms of exclusivity, has been losing ground. I think that the problems of innovation in Europe, the duration of market exclusivity is one element, but it's not the key element. Now, bottom line, I said at the beginning, I think the reform goes in the right direction, but it's really playing around with the exclusivity periods. And I think this is the right moment for the Commission and the Member States and the European Parliament to think of additional instruments. And I will just mention them briefly, because I think Matthias will say a lot more about them. Think of financial engineering, for example, special purpose vehicles to finance early stage research, centralized health technology assessment. That was the possibility of going to, now we have a first reform, but we could go even further. Matthias will mention it. And then this perennial issue of parallel imports, which is driven by differences in pricing across member states, meaning with this difference, you have different access or different accessibility across member states. In order to reduce this tension, maybe, well, I'll let Matthias explain what I have in mind here. I'll stop here. Thank you, Hilde.
Thank you so much, Professor Siotis. Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
You showed, well, unless there is a student with a question, but I did not see any questions coming in. So for now, I will just ask my question. You showed a slide, it's a little bit before, where you showed, and you actually stated the orphan drug designation is different from the market authorization, but it's nearly the same. It was,
Yeah,
yes,
this
this
one,
one.
it
Yes,
correlates.
indeed. But then I was thinking for myself, but also for the student. So you get your orphan designation before you get your market authorization. Does this mean when it's practically the same that there is no failure in the
No, 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 no,
clinical
no, no.
trial
Sorry.
process, or is it the conditional market authorization? Can
It's
you?
it's not a condition. No, no. You can have your marketing authorization, which is then reviewed,
Mhm,
okay? But before the marketing authorization, you have your designation. And as you
mhm,
can see, the scale is very different. In Europe, we don't have 1,000, 2,000 orphan drugs. We have about 300, a bit less than 300 orphan drugs. But here it's the designation. So before you get your marketing authorization, you apply for orphan designation, which is the potential.
yeah,
And, this potential may never be realized, never. And in fact, for most drugs that are designed, the most active ingredients that are designed as potentially orphan drugs, most of them do not see the light of a marketing authorization because you basically go to the EMA, you say, look, on the basis of the evidence, on the basis of this, etc., I think this could work. But then in order to show that it actually works and, doing a clinical trial, which in the case of orphan diseases, they tend to be very different because the patient population is very limited and sometimes extremely limited. So you have different types of clinical trials, and these may fail, or you may just ask for your designation and do nothing. And that's why the commission has said, you can get your designation for 7 years, and if you do nothing, you just lose it. You know, because you could imagine, I'm thinking out loud, but you could imagine a pharma firm asking for designations all over the place as a signal, to other potential competitors, don't come in because I'm already, uh, likely to succeed. So, in order to speed up and to avoid this kind of strategic behavior, the Commission has said 7 years max. Or that's the proposal, at least.
very clear. Thank you. Diego, you raised your hands. Do you have a question? Not sure. No, I don't hear anything nor see anything. Um, Can you, because you work with pharma a lot, can you allude to how the pharma currently reacts to the proposed reform?
I think it's been a long time since I've had, well, a long time. The initial, you see, okay, I don't want to say something I will later regret later on, but the initial proposal of the Commission was to say you will lose your exclusivity, but that was for the general regulation. You had 8 years of data exclusivity plus 2 years of market exclusivity. So that de facto you had 10 years. Just like in orphans, you have 10 years of market exclusivity in the current system. Now, what the Commission wanted to do was to reduce the period of data exclusivity, and firms had the possibility of clawing it back, of getting it back, if the drug would be made available in the 27 member states over a 2-year period. Okay, so The Commission said, okay, since access is so unequal across the EU, in Cyprus, in Romania, you have half of the drugs that you have in Germany. I'm inventing the number, but it's something like that. And in addition, the Romanians and the Cypriots, they get it much later in time. If you want to get back your longer exclusivity period, data exclusivity period, you need to make the drug available in the 27 member states within 2 years. Industry was very negative with respect to that clause, and I think they had a point, quite simply because it was materially impossible to make the drug available within 2 years in 27 member states. Quite simply because some member states would not even start negotiations before other member states had accepted the drug. In some member states, the rule says Sweden, France, and Germany has to reimburse it, and then we can start negotiations. And these kind of negotiations, they don't last, 1 week. They take months and months and months and months. The Belgian system very well, so it takes quite a while going through committees and committees and committees. So the reaction was quite negative on that. I think they're quite happy that this has been dropped. Okay. Generally speaking, they play very much the card, well, if you make it tougher for us, meaning, shorter exclusivity periods, industry will leave. Is this cheap talk? I quite simply don't know. I personally think, and I'm not a life scientist, I personally think that innovation, the whole ecosystem matters for innovation. And it's not only the length of the exclusivity period, which is what the reform is all about. And the modulation of that exclusivity period is the only factor that playing a role. I think yesterday, a number of times, funding, venture capital funding was mentioned many, many times. I think capital markets union in Europe is probably much more important determinant of R&D, pharma R&D, than the length of the exclusivity period.
Yeah, it's super complex, and I hope that the students understand the complexity, because indeed there's more than the exclusivity reforms or the proposed reforms. And I think indeed, as you quite mentioned well, that there's definitely room for putting more incentives on drug repurposing. I think we haven't unlocked the potential there, definitely. I received a question from Diego, I see. He wanted actually to basically ask whether chain-linked patents prevent other manufacturers from producing previous generation drugs.
You have the issue of evergreening and chain linking. It's closely related. Now, let me give you the example of product hopping or evergreening. Now, if you have, and this is not illegal, huh? I'm not saying in any way that this is illegal. If you have a marketing authorization for an orphan drug, you can give permission to somebody else to enter. Okay? Now, you could give permission in exchange for money. And I don't think that would be illegal. It would kind of be, I give you a share of the pie and you pay for it. The alternative is to give permission to yourself. Example, I have an orphan drug. The 10 years of exclusivity are going to end. And I make an epsilon modification on my drug, and or I have a drug that the mode of action is very similar, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a different drug. And I give myself permission to enter on with this other drug on that market. And I withdraw the first one because you can withdraw your orphan designation whenever you want. You can just say the requirement is commercial reasons, but you don't have to say which commercial reasons. So that in this case, you had the first 10 years of exclusivity, then you give yourself permission to enter into that market with a very similar product in your own portfolio, and you withdraw the first product, and you get another 10 years. And this is something which has happened with Glivec and Tasigna. I can't remember the name of it was some myeloma, I think, that was treated with Glivec, and then Novartis gave itself permission to enter with Tasigna, which is also a Novartis product, and then withdrew the designation for Glivec for that particular disease. So that's the kind of now what the Commission proposal is saying is that if you have a situation like this, you should not prevent generic producers of Glivec, once you have generic versions of Glivec, to be able to enter the market for where Tasigna is. Okay? So that, if you have a second generation product, you cannot prevent, because now currently, if you have the second generation product or a slightly different product, you cannot have generics of the previous product entering to treat that disease. That should change with the current proposals. And the chain-linked, imagine you have a subdivision of a cancer such that, it's 5 rare cancers, because, the characterization makes them very rare cancers, but they are very similar. Something works. Something works for cancer 1, or the first type of cancers, right? What you can do, and these were the chain-linked ones, is to, benefit from exclusivity for 10 years on type subdivision 1. When you're getting close to exclusivity, you apply for another therapeutic indication, and you get another extra 10 years. Now, you can do that in the current proposal, but it will be limited to 2 additional therapeutic indications. So the chain linking will be much more limited than it was under the current framework. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yes. Well, it was clear to me. I hope, Diego, for you too. If not, don't hesitate to write an email or to ask a question after, I would say, the break. We will thank you so much, Professor Siotis. I hope you can stay with us for the next talks.
I will.
We will have yes, thank you. We will take a short break until 10:45 and then come back for Jorge's talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.